brought notes because I graduated from North Central. That's what we do. So just be prepared. I even have 3 points.
Wow.
So like that. I want to start off by saying it's a little difficult for me to come up here. I've been reticent to do so. Scott's been asking me for 5 years now to come up and share my story. And it's the reason I have been is well, many reasons actually. Probably the simplest is that I'd rather wax philosophical than talk about my personal life. But also, I have a reticence to talk about my story because I really value community. I really value this community, but I know that I hold theological positions that are probably disparate from the majority of people in this room. And I've always worried that sharing some of them might cause discord or cause people to say, I don't really want to know that guy anymore. And so I didn't want to share it, but two things have changed my mind. One is Scott's persistence and even apparently catering an entire message series to people who have weird theological beliefs. And the second was talking with my wife, who convinced me, much like Dave was saying, that an integral part of community is sharing your story. And it's been 6 years since I was up here. And for those of you who don't know, part of my story is that I was the first intern at this church. So yeah, my legacy still exists. And so I shared a lot for the first few years that I was here, but I haven't since then. And so I don't think anybody but maybe Adam and Scott and Amber were here the last time I talked. So I feel like it's probably time for me to share my story, or at least parts of it, so that there's some context and maybe it's not as scary as I think it is. My faith journey is a lot like I imagine a lot of you in here. I grew up in the church. My mom was an avid fundamentalist Christian, so I went to 3 services in Sunday school and felt boards and all that jazz. But there was a bit of a distinction in my story in that my father, for the first 9 years of my life, was a professed Muslim, and that caused some confusion for me. My parents didn't have a good relationship when I was younger. My father left a lot. They fought a lot. He would leave for days, weeks, months sometimes. He left for a year at one point when I was 5. And my mom always interpreted their marital strife through the lens of like some kind of divine punishment. She said that she had been unequally yoked and she had chosen to disobey God, marrying a Muslim, and so he was not blessing their marriage. And that was really weird and hard for me as a 5-year-old to kind of process, because when my dad wasn't around, it kind of made sense. It filtered the world really nicely, and he was the bad guy, and we understood why, because he was Muslim. But when he was around, he was cool, and I liked him. And I couldn't really figure out, like, did he just stop being Muslim when he came back, or did God like him when he was in the house? It didn't make sense. And then it got even weirder when he stayed, and they started working things out, because then he wasn't really the bad guy at all anymore. And then when I was about 10, he converted to Christianity, which made it worse because their marriage still sucked. But now he was a Christian, so there wasn't that excuse anymore. And so for a few years, I really wrestled with how to interpret the world because of that. And I finally decided, for my own sanity's sake, to just kind of suppress the question. It seemed that it was working. After a few years of my dad being in the house, their marriage was getting better. And so I just assumed that, well, I couldn't quite understand it. There must be some equation in heaven of like, do righteous things, life gets better for you eventually if you have a long picture. So I decided to become as good of a Christian as I could, and I not to brag, but I was quite successful at it. In my high school days, aside from 1 year of drug-laden stupidity, I was like the model youth at my church. I led small groups and youth group. I became a youth leader. I was in charge of a Royal Rangers group, if anybody knows what that is. Training young boys, it's a dangerous thing. I even got a calling to the ministry, like one gets a cold. And I was exactly what I thought God would want. So with my calling, I went to North Central to hone my skills as an evangelist, because I had one of the guys in my church that I had kind of mentored me through high school was the evangelism dude at the church. Everyone has that guy. But he took me all over. We go down to downtown Lincoln, the tough streets of downtown Lincoln, and hand out tracts and be really relational, because that's what you do as an evangelist. And we went to Sturgis twice. I evangelized a group of Hells Angels bikers once. Not my finest moment. Nothing came of it, but I felt really good because I survived it. I even went to Mardi Gras once and carried a giant, like full-size wooden cross down Bourbon Street, singing every verse of Amazing Grace. So I was impressive. But when I got to North Central, I kind of dove into the same thing. I joined the evangelism team, and within a semester, I was the head of the evangelism team. I was on the student ministries board and a lot of other credentials that I don't put on my resume because nobody cares about them. But I was doing really well in terms of impressing God, I thought. And I decided to lead a group back to Mardi Gras North Central students, because I'd been there before, and it was a good place to save souls and improve your resume. So that is where everything kind of changed for me, actually. And I want to share 3 points. This is my 3-point sermon, 3 seminal moments in my life, because if I were to go through the entire thing, Scott wouldn't get any time to share today, and I know that he really wants to. Though it was like some kind of agreement. Every point that I go over, you cut one from yours, right? Yeah. So we're good. So I'm in Mardi Gras for the second time. I'm in the French Quarter, and I'm sharing relational evangelizing the heck out of everyone I see, because I'm leading the group, and you have to be good at that. And up saunters a group of about 35 gay gentlemen doing some kind of like parade dance thing. A lot of cowboys in the group. And it struck me as this fantastic opportunity to like stretch myself. I mean, I've shared my faith and witnessed to countless people at this point, and like I said, I've even done a group of dangerous bikers, so how scary can a group of gay men be? And so I picked a gentleman with a cowboy hat, and my wife says I can't say the rest of his clothes, but he was wearing leather chaps and not much else. He was on the outside of the group, and I thought this is probably a good sign that he's desperate for some kind of connection, which is usually what you're looking for in evangelism, because it's easier, makes your job easier. And so I went up to him and in fine relational form asked him how Mardi Gras was going, hoping that he was going to say, like, my life's a mess and it's just terrible. That would have been really easy, and I would have been able to win right away. But he didn't say that. He just said that he was having a good time, unfortunately. And so I went through the litany of relational questions that I'd learned at North Central and from growing up in the church to ask. And nowhere in his story could I find any despair to latch onto. Nowhere in his story could I find somebody who seemingly needed my answers, and I was a little frustrated by that. So I decided, as much as I hated to do it, I was going to pull out the big guns, just ask him, if you were to die tonight, do you know where you would go? It's kind of a buzzkill when somebody's trying to have fun at Mardi Gras and ask that question. But I didn't have any other choice, I thought, and I figured, what's one ruined night of debauchery in comparison to the salvation of your soul? Yeah. So I asked that question, and his response really floored me. Again, I heard about every response you could hear to this question at this point in life. And I was expecting him to have one of the usual ones, but he didn't. He didn't break down and cry and say, I wish I knew, but I don't. Super easy, right? He didn't get mad at me and start, threatening to punch me, which has happened many times. And I didn't necessarily want that, but I was prepared for it. He didn't, want to engage me in some grand theological debate, which I secretly was hoping for. Instead, he just said, yeah, I'm going to heaven. And that, it struck me as really odd, not just the words, but the tone in which he did it, because it wasn't like it was a gotcha for him. I mean, I've had people respond that way because they're tired of people evangelizing them, and that's like their way to stick it to them. But he was honestly just sharing like a joy that was welling up inside of him. And not only did he say that, but then he went on to thank me for asking the question and went into this 10-minute story of his life and his faith. And he wasn't evangelizing me, though. That was what was happening. But there was this moment where I realized that my equation wasn't working anymore. And I was forced to face that question that I was asking when I was a kid and my dad wasn't around. And that is, where is God in all of this? And the answer for this was in a leather chapped cowboy. And, he had his connection to God was the most real connection I had seen at that point. I mean, his story was so heartfelt and he was so happy. And he even, and this was the weirdest part, he even connected his lewd dancing at Mardi Gras to some kind of connection with God. Like this was an intimate moment for him because in living and connecting with people, he was finding God. And as I was thinking about this story, I was remembering the parable of the kingdom in Matthew 13. It says the kingdom of heaven is like the yeast a woman used in making bread, and even though she put only a little yeast in 3 measures of flour, it permeated every part of the dough. I learned that the kingdom of God, that God permeates everything. It's not found in a church or creed. It's not found in a dogma or a righteous life. God's found everywhere. And that there's a true joy in connecting with the divine as it blossoms in the most unexpected places. The second moment that I want to share with you from my life is probably the toughest one for me to share. Come on. So, about 5 years ago, jeez, I don't cry. At least not in public. My dad died, and that was life-altering, paradigm-changing. He'd been dealing with cancer for 2 years. Don't start. He'd been dealing with cancer for 2 years, so we knew it was coming, but you don't really prepare for that. There's no way to be ready for your dad to die. And it was another one of those equations that I had wrong in life. I saw life as a blessing, and I thought if life is the ultimate blessing, then death is this ultimate curse. And I couldn't understand how a man who had lived through what he had and who had done the hard stuff, he converted to Christianity. That's what you're supposed to do. That's like a success story, right? Was going to die at 48. That's absurd. But what made it harder than just losing my dad was my dad's response to the whole thing. So my dad was probably the strongest person that I've ever known. He was a fighter, but not in the UFC kind of sense. He was just this really internally strong person that knew himself and knew who he was. And it came from a life full of adversity. He was shipped to the United States at 15 to avoid the draft in Iran because his parents didn't want him to go fighting in the Iran-Iraq War. And he lived in Queens, New York with his 11-year-old cousin and took the New York City subway to downtown Manhattan for high school. He spoke little to no English the first 2 years he was here. And he basically had to forge an identity as a dual citizen on his own. He went to a Christian college as a Muslim. That's where he met my mom during the Iran hostage crisis. So he experienced bigotry and isolation firsthand. And then he married a woman that felt guilt about marrying him for the first 10 years of their marriage. And on top of that, as conservative as my mom was, my grandmother, his mom, was equally as conservative Muslim. So the two women in his life couldn't accept the other one or their worldview, and he was kind of forced to be a uniter of two very disparate worlds. And through that, he was able to do it by being strong, by fighting against his own insecurities, by fighting against his lack of identity, by forging something that allowed him to be himself in the most difficult situations. And so when he got sick, I know he attacked it like he attacked every other adversity in his life, which was to gird up his strength, his inner strength, and to fight it. But the problem is when you're dying, that's the worst thing you can do. I mean, you're fighting yourself. The very thing that had made him strong was the thing he had to conquer. He had to surrender to his own end, and he didn't. The most haunting experience of my life was sitting at his bedside, watching him fight for breath for no reason. And I remember asking myself, I can find God in a gay cowboy, but I can't find God here. And as I was thinking about this story, which I think about a lot, I was reminded of the parable of the kingdom in Mark, where God says the kingdom of God is if a man should scatter seed on the ground and should sleep by night and rise by day, and the seed should sprout and grow. He himself does not know how, for the earth yields crops by itself, first the blade, then the head, and after that the full grain. But when the grain ripens, he immediately puts in the sickle because the harvest has come. I learned in that moment that the kingdom of God isn't just everywhere, it's in everything, even the painful things, and it's unavoidable. It's always there, but we have to see it. Which brings me to my final point and story, and I know I've gone over and I apologize. This one happened 2 years ago at the Occupy rally. Anybody else join me in the Occupy movement? No? I was alone, me and the 99%. So I went down to the People's Square, the government center, to rally with the occupiers because I felt a deep sense of connection to the people in our community that have been taken advantage of, that have been oppressed by a system that's unfair. And I thought I was going because I was compassionate, but when I got there, I found that I was there because I was bitter. And the reason I found that out is because everyone else there seemed to be bitter as well, and we really fed off of each other. And so we formed a marching group of about 300 of us, and we marched down to the Federal Reserve to protest the man, and chanting and getting our best Peter Seeger on. And when we got down there, we were all huddled outside of the main door. I don't know if you guys know where that's at first, but there's those like slabs of rock. We're all just yelling and chanting, and as I'm watching this scene happen, I noticed that there's this Buddhist monk just chilling, meditating on one of those slabs in the middle of 300 angry protesters. It was the most surreal scene. He apparently had been there before we got there and didn't flinch. I don't even know if he knew that we were there, which was crazy because we were loud and we were like brushing up against him, and there was like palpable anger in the air. And he just sat there for a couple minutes, and finally one of the other protesters, because all protesters are, very considerate, tapped him on the shoulder and said, hey. The Buddhist monk turns and looks at him and smiles. He doesn't respond, just smiles at him. And the protester gets like really angry. What are you smiling about? He said, aren't you mad? Doesn't this just piss you off? And the monk said, mad about what? And he said, aren't you mad at all these corrupt rich people that got their foot on the necks of the poor? That they're doing this, they're taking advantage of people just to make a quick buck. And there's so much injustice happening in this country, and you're a monk. Aren't you just pissed off about this? And the monk's response was fantastic. He said, with a smile still on his face, I do feel your pain, but do you not feel theirs? And he points to the people inside the Federal Reserve. He says, it matters not who is rich or poor, but rather who is free or not. And it floored me hearing that, because he said his piece, which is this like profound thing, and then he just turned around and started meditating again. And the guy didn't know what to say. He just stopped chanting and walked away. Like, oh, we're at 299 now. But as I was recalling this story, I remembered the parable of the kingdom that says, kingdom of God is like a merchant searching for a fine pearl. And when he found that very valuable pearl, he went and sold everything he had and bought it. Watching that monk's response, I learned that the true value of the kingdom is sought internally, and it's a perspective. The kingdom of God is in everything and everywhere, then the true value is in being able to see it. Jesus hits on that time and time again. He says, the knowledge of the secrets of the kingdom of God have been given to you, but to others I speak in parables, so that seeing they may not see, and having ears they may not hear. And I think that there's this incredible value in seeing God everywhere, and it really does redeem the pain and the joy and the suffering of life, and it answers that so difficult question for at least for me, which is how can God allow pain and suffering? Because he's in it, he's a part of it. He experiences it from every angle. I'm reminded of my favorite quote from Meister Eckhart, a 13th century German theologian. I don't know how many of you are familiar with him. But he, in his most famous sermon, he has one very famous quote among my friends at least. It says, the eye through which I see God is the same eye through which God sees me. My eye and God's eye are one eye, one seeing, one knowing, one loving. I think that for me, that's the beauty of life, is connecting to the God in everything and inside of myself. And in this community that I've now for 9 years been a part of, I'll just sum up by saying this. I think that my life story, that sounds so long, 32 whole years, to this point has been about trying to find God in all of the wrong places, and then finding out he was there anyways. And that's been a huge blessing. So thank you for letting me share with you.